Hello, I'm Clayton Brough, and welcome to nearly 1,000 years of family history. In this video, you'll see and hear how one of the world's largest ancestral family organizations has discovered and shared its family history with thousands of relatives living in many countries and on several continents. As president of the Richard Brough Family Organization, or RBFO, I hope you enjoy this true story that covers nearly 1,000 years.
Like most people who have lived on this earth and experienced life throughout the generations of time, our Brough ancestors experienced a lot of challenges and struggles. However, by and large, they were faithful to their families and contributed much to their civic and religious communities. In fact, in most cases, the beliefs we now have and the freedoms we enjoy are largely a result of their efforts and sacrifices. And I believe that as we better understand the lives and experiences of our ancestors, we come to appreciate more fully what we now have and enjoy.
The story of the Broughs of Staffordshire begins with the Norman invasion of England. In the fall of 1066, William, the Duke of Normandy, crossed the English Channel with about 600 ships and 12,000 men. At the Battle of Hastings, William, who was also known as William the Conqueror, defeated King Harold of England and his Anglo-Saxon forces. On Christmas Day in 1066, William was crowned King of England, and he eventually rewarded his Norman supporters with large grants of land and important positions. In the 1100s, some of King William's supporters had settled in Staffordshire, where their descendants adopted the surname Burgo. By the 1600s, the surname had changed to Brough. The word Brough is an ancient English place name meaning camp, fortification, or manor house, and it also meant a round tower or the outer wall of a feudal castle. Over several centuries, many Brough-related families lived in southern and central Staffordshire.
Renton is a small village in central Staffordshire, located about 3 miles west of Stafford City. Its parish church, All Saints, is very old, with part of the building dating back to the 1200s or 13th century. In 2008, RBFO family members visited All Saints and discovered the mention of Brough Hall on one of the oldest gravestones that still lies next to the church. Today, Brough Hall is located about 1 mile southwest of Renton. The present building dates from the 1700s and stands on the site of the ancient manor house of Brough. The building is well maintained and serves as the centerpiece of a working farm. About 1 mile southwest of Brough Hall is the town of Nosal, a large and ancient village. Its parish church, St. Lawrence, is a beautiful and large edifice. Many Brough families have lived in Nosal, including William Brough and Jane Mere, who in the 1800s had 9 children, 5 of whom emigrated to Utah and California.
I say, please come into our church, wander around. We do have, you can see we have a lot of gravestones here. We have a list.
In the 1500s, a number of Brough families had moved into northern Staffordshire. There, they established more than a half-dozen principal Brough houses on the Leekfrith, a large, fertile green valley in the Staffordshire moorlands that is bordered by hills and rocky outcroppings. On the Leekfrith, these Brough houses generally contain manor houses and land holdings, and were known by their geographic locations such as Middlehume, Newgrange, Waterhouse, and Windygates. Today, thousands of Broughs are descended from these ancient Brough houses, including most members of the Richard Brough Family Organization.
In 2002, our son Adam Brough hiked to the top of Hencloud, which is over 1,300 feet high. Hencloud overlooks the Leekfrith area, where many Brough families have resided since the 1500s. On one of the large rocks near the top of Hencloud, Adam spotted an old weathered hand carving that read Brough T, possibly representing a Thomas Brough.
My cousin Nathan Meekum and I were on top of Hens Cloud, overlooking this view, this panorama of history of where my family lived. And while we were there taking in this beautiful scenery, I looked down on some boulders that we were close to and noticed a name etched in the rock. And the name that was etched on the stone was Brough T. I could not help but think about my third great-grandfather, who was also named Thomas Brough, who left England, came to the United States, with his wife Jane Patterson, where he later moved to Utah and had 5 children.
Below Hencloud is Windygates, an ancient Brough manor hall built by Thomas Brough. In 1620, Thomas married Elizabeth Cotton, and by the 1630s he was known as a gentleman and landholder who had erected a large hall at Windygates where he had inscribed his initials over the top of its porch entrance that read TB 1634. Today, Windygates is a beautiful farmhouse owned and operated by Jeff and Rose Robinson. Jeff is a third cousin 10 times removed to Thomas Brough, who originally built Windygates, and he is also a distant cousin to many members of the Richard Brough Family Organization, some of whom visited Windygates in 2008.
You probably all know it was built in 1634. And what we do know, this part of the house was, I presume this part of the house would be 1634, and this end was built some years later. Probably about 30 or 40, I think. All I know really is it's oak. I don't know whether it was new timber when it was put in, or whether it was from ships, or where it was from really. I presume probably these would be new timbers.
Yeah.
Some in the roof are from ships, because it has been cut out in certain places.
Yeah, are these, is that original, the stone?
Yeah.
Yes, I would think it's all original, yeah.
So we was knocking the old plaster off and he uncovered this stone archway, which we didn't know about and you wouldn't. Long before Jeff's mother's, I mean, and it's been in the family since 1930 something, but nobody's seen that, you see. And I suppose it could have been covered up for 100, 200 years, couldn't it really? But you don't value things necessarily at the time. Afterwards you think, oh, why did we do that, or why did we demolish that? And you chuck things out, don't you? And then 20 years later, what a shame, we chucked them away. They're gone.
Was the timber in the fireplace was exposed already?
This, we've added this to it.
Oh, okay.
That wasn't there. That's not original. It was just the outside stones. And then it had been filled up with some stones up each side. Because as you see on the archway, it's just 2 stones.
Yeah.
In 1702, another Thomas Brough married Edith Brinley. Thomas inherited Middlehume from his father and subsequently enlarged it, placing his initials and date TB 1718 above the doorway of the manor house. Thomas Brough was a very resourceful and successful individual, and by the time he died at the age of 80, he had acquired additional properties in Staffordshire. In 2002, Middlehume underwent renovation. Adam Brough, who was 6 foot 4 inches in height, is shown here going through a doorway inside Middlehume.
During the 17 and 1800s, many Brough families settled in other areas of northern Staffordshire. For example, in 1700, Ralph Brough was christened in St. Lawrence the Martyr Church in Rushton Spencer, and married Martha Holland in 1727. Ralph Brough is the 5th great-grandfather of James or Jim Henry Brough, who is shown here with his wife Rosemary. The Church of St. Lawrence in Rushton Spencer stands on top of a hill that overlooks a beautiful part of the Staffordshire moorlands. People have worshipped at St. Lawrence for over 700 years, with portions of the church building dating back to the late 1200s. Rushton's St. Lawrence Church was once called the Church in the Wilderness. A rather narrow road leads from the highway up towards the church, but then widens out at the top of the hill. Graves lie next to the church, and a large graveyard extends down the hill from the chapel and contains a number of Brough headstones.
The second son of Ralph Brough was also named Ralph Brough. This Ralph Brough was christened at St. Lawrence in Biddulph in 1730. He married Martha Boone in 1751, and after Martha died, he married Anne Rushton in 1794. The church at St. Lawrence Biddulph is a magnificent structure and sits on the site of an early church that dates back to pre-Norman times. In fact, people have worshipped at Biddulph St. Lawrence since the 9th century. The church building was heavily damaged during the English Civil War of the mid-1600s, but was beautifully rebuilt in 1836. For several hundred years, many Brough families have resided in Biddulph, and some of their gravestones are still visible.
The town of Leek is in northern Staffordshire and dates back to the early 1200s. For hundreds of years, the town was a regular cattle market, but during the Industrial Revolution, it became a major producer of textiles. Since the 1500s, many Brough-related families have lived in and around Leek and contributed much to its development. For example, the land for Brough Park was donated to the town of Leek in 1913 by William Spooner Brough, who was the son of Joshua Brough, a well-known silk manufacturer and a kind and public-spirited man. In 1837, Joshua Brough engaged Joshua Nicholson to be a representative of J&J Brough and Company, which eventually became Brough, Nicholson and Hall Limited. And these two Joshuas played a big part in the rise and prosperity of Leek as a silk town. St. Edward the Confessor Church in Leek was built in 980 A.D., rebuilt in 1214, and the arch was constructed in 1684. For hundreds of years, many Brough-related christenings, marriages, and funerals have been held in this church. In 2008, RBFO members assembled in St. Edward's to hear a presentation by Philip Brough on the history of some of the Brough families of Leek.
Since the 1500s, many Brough families of northern Staffordshire have used the Brough coat of arms of 5 white swans within a black diagonal cross on a silver shield. In 1884, John Slay published the Brough Shield in his book, The History of the Ancient Parish of Leek. In 1949, Edgar Brough of Leek commissioned original artwork showing the shield of the Brough coat of arms, which was done by a London printer. In 1980, the RBFO included the shield within its official logo. In July 2009, the RBFO commissioned a professional artist to recreate the shield of the Brough coat of arms, which is shown here.
Much of the story about the Broughs of England would not be known if it were not for many years of research by 2 individuals, Catherine Ann Brough and James Henry Brough. In 1954, Catherine Ann Brough married Stanley Maurice Hind, who became a well-respected vicar in the Church of England. Anne is the foremost Brough historian in the world, and during the past 30 years she has conducted extensive genealogical and historical research on the Broughs of England, as her own ancestry goes back to the Broughs of Middlehume, Leekfrith, Staffordshire. Many of her ancestors and relatives are buried in Merebrook, including her parents, Edgar and Rose Brough, and her great-grandparents, William and Catherine Brough. In 2008, Anne Hine briefly talked about some of the ancestors and descendants of the Broughs of Staffordshire at the International Brough Reunion held in Merebrook.
One or two people have asked me, well, where did we come from before we got here? We do know, for absolute certain, that a particular line of father and son, or sons, lived near to Nossal. And they were there from about 1160 through to the Black Death, which was, 1349. And you find that not just the Broughs down there, but Mrs. Brough, at the time, was a Weston from Weston Hall. And her family was dying of the Black Death. And as each one died, they made a new will and a new will, and they're all being saved. And they passed their property then, when there were no more Westons left, to what was a scrap of people who were left of the Broughs in that place. And then they became the Broughs of Weston. And then they're going to move on, and they don't disappear. They start to dissipate from that area. They go in all directions. But by 1470s, they certainly were in Cheshire, just over the border, and then they began to appear here until there was Robert Brough, who was the forester at Dudacress Abbey, which is just down the lane opposite. And he had some son, and when the abbey was destroyed and there was the Reformation, the land around here was already in parcels, and some of them were sold on, and some of them were leased on. All their wills say that their cousins at Windygates, they're cousins at New Grange, they're cousins at the Waterhouse, which buildings are now underneath the reservoir, and they're cousins at Middle Hume. So it's all one big family. As for the ones at Middle Hume, I think probably if the water board hadn't flooded the valley, there would be some of them at Middle Hume yet. They certainly were here the longest of the lot, although we're still well represented at Windygates, because the Robinson family, and I keep looking for them. Oh, you're there. Right. And who was so generous as to open the house for you this afternoon. They are our kin, and so we've still got a bit of us up there.
Let's give the Robinsons a hand.
Oh.
In 1970, James Henry Brough married Rosemary Rigby. Since 2000, Jim has conducted extensive genealogical research on many Brough families, and his own ancestry goes back to the Broughs of Biddulph, Rushton Spencer, and Leek. Also, for several years, Jim has volunteered his time transcribing historical documents at the Staffordshire Record Office in Stafford, England.
My name is James Brough. I started coming here about 10 years ago, purely for my own interest, family history, before I'd met anybody from the RBFO, before I'd met Anne Hind. But eventually, having met Anne, I was subcontracted to do work for Anne and do work for the RBFO, and eventually to do work for the Staffordshire Record Office as a volunteer, transcribing poor law records, admissions, and things for the workhouses of Staffordshire. It's a pleasure to come here. The people are friendly, the people are helpful, as you can see today. I never expected to find what Thea and her people have put out here today. I think it's wonderful.
The Staffordshire Record Office is an excellent place to conduct genealogical and historical research. In 2008, officials of the Staffordshire Record Office kindly and expertly provided RBFO members with a beautiful and well-documented display of many old and informative Brough family documents.
What I'd really just like to say to you is that all this material is here and more for people to use. It's not locked away and never produced. People can come into the reading room in the Staffordshire Record Office and order down any of these items, and indeed other items within the collection, and find out more about the Brough family.
In 2008, many other old but valuable Brough family documents were located in England. Some of these documents date back to the 1500s and contain marriage settlements, property deeds, and family records of the Broughs of Leek. Also, several of these documents are in Latin and written on skins or parchment, and not on paper. Scientific preservation is necessary to protect these documents from deterioration, and the RBFO has and is supporting such preservation efforts.
This very old document was written on parchment in 1572. This document is a release of land by Thomas and Richard Gent back to Thomas Brough of Middle Hume, and Thomas Brough was my 10th great-grandfather.
The Richard Brough Family Organization is named after Richard Brough, who was born in 1786 in Trentham, Staffordshire, England. As a young man, Richard Brough learned the trades of carpentry and brickmaking, but when he was 19 years old, he joined the British Army and became a gunner, and served for the next 17 years in the 8th Battalion of the Royal Artillery Service. Due to an injury to his ankles, Richard was discharged from the Army in 1822. In 1825, Richard married Mary Harleston in St. Peter's Church in Stoke-upon-Trent, and they became the parents of 10 children, most of whom were christened in the Church of St. John Longton, which was demolished in 1979. In 1840, Richard joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and later on, 5 of his 10 children also joined the LDS Church. With 3 of them, Thomas, Elizabeth, and Samuel, eventually immigrating to Utah. While living with his wife and children in Longton, Blurton, and Trentham, Richard worked primarily as a brickmaker. He died in 1873 and is buried in the churchyard of the Church of the Resurrection in Dresden, Staffordshire. Unfortunately, no gravestone for Richard Brough is visible today in the Dresden churchyard. In fact, parts of the churchyard are severely overgrown because the church is now closed.
When we arrived at the churchyard in Dresden, it was very obviously abandoned. There were broken windows, boards over the windows. The graveyard was quite grown over. It's very humid and very moist there, and so everything grows very quickly. The grass was knee-high. It was wet. The thorns and vines had grown over the headstones, so that it was very difficult to find the actual names and dates as you walked through the graveyard. So it was fascinating to search, and somewhat disappointing that we could not find his actual gravestone, although you could sense his presence and that we were in a very special spot.
Many of the Broughs of Dresden can trace their family ancestry to the Broughs of Leekfrith in the 1500s. Between the 1600s and 1800s, a number of Broughs moved from their agricultural areas of northern Staffordshire southward to the towns of Stoke-on-Trent, Trentham, Burslem, Woolstanton, Longton, and Dresden. Richard Brough's seventh cousin, 3 times removed, was Jabez Brough, who worked as a potter's presser and lived in Dresden most of his life.
Like Richard Brough, Jabez Brough is also buried in the Dresden churchyard. Jabez's descendants include Edgar Brough, Ronald Vincent Brough, and Ronald Peter Brough. The genealogical relationship between the descendants of Richard Brough and Jabez Brough has been proven using genealogical and historical records and scientifically based Y-DNA testing.
From 1886 to 1890, Samuel Richard Brough, a grandson to Richard Brough, served a 4-year LDS mission to the British Isles. During this time, Samuel gathered hundreds of names of his family and deceased relatives for eventual LDS temple work. Samuel lived to be 90 years old and died in 1947. However, during his many years of family research and communication, Samuel came to believe that many of the Broughs of Staffordshire were related to one another, and this has now been proven through extensive genealogical research and scientific DNA testing.
After Richard Brough married Mary Horliston in 1825, they named their first son Richard Brough Jr. Richard Jr. was christened in 1827 in Longton, Staffordshire, and later married Rosanna Myatt in 1846. He worked as a coal miner, a potter, and a brick burner in Staffordshire. Richard and Rosanna raised 5 children, including Richard Myatt Brough, who was born 3 months prior to their marriage. Richard Myatt Brough was definitely the son of Rosanna Myatt, but according to DNA evidence, he was probably the stepson of Richard Brough Jr. However, Rosanna Myatt's grandmother was Margaret Brough, who was actually a 7th cousin to Richard Brough, who married Mary Horliston. So the descendants of Richard Myatt Brough are probably Broughs by adoption through their male Brough surname line, and Broughs by blood through their female Myatt ancestry. In 1866, Richard Myatt Brough married Elizabeth Bradburn, and they named their first son Thomas Myatt Brough. In 1885, Thomas Myatt Brough left England and sailed to Australia, where he married Ellen France in 1888 in New South Wales. The 8th child of Thomas Myatt Brough and Ellen France was Roy Victor Myatt Brough, who married Marjorie Black in 1922. The first child of Roy Victor Myatt Brough and Marjorie Black was Roy Edward Brough, who married Norma Hall in 1946, and who subsequently provided the RBFO with the genealogies of his Australian ancestors and relatives. Roy Edward Brough's son, Roy Victor Brough, married Joanne Ralph in 1970. Other descendants and relatives of the Broughs of Australia include Thomas Brough and Joan Ellen Brough of Queensland, who are children of Roy Victor Myatt Brough, and Edward Richard Myatt Brough, who married Catherine Howard Dawson, and their nephew, Douglas William Howard, who married Joan Gordon. During the past several years, the Broughs of Australia and America have occasionally visited each other, with Bonnie Youngberg of Idaho visiting Roy and Joanne Brough in Australia in 2004, then Roy and Joanne visiting RBFO members in Utah in 2005, and Marshall Ward Brough visiting Roy and Joanne in Australia in 2009.
Back in England, some of Richard Brough and Mary Horlston's children and grandchildren worked in the Staffordshire potteries during the 1860s and 1870s. For example, Richard Brough's youngest daughter, Mary Ann Brough, married Robert Evans in 1865 and worked as a potter's transfer in Longton from about 1861 to 1881. Mary Ann joined the LDS Church in 1857 and was present at both of her parents' deaths. Both Mary Ann and Robert Evans are buried in the Longton Cemetery near Spring Garden Road, but no memorial stones are now visible.
Thomas Brough was the second son of Richard Brough and Mary Horlston. He joined the LDS Church in 1848 and married Jean Patterson, who was usually called Jane Patterson, in 1851 in Staffordshire. In 1856, Thomas and Jane and their two small children, Martha Jane and William George Brough, sailed from Liverpool, England to Boston, Massachusetts, aboard the ship Horizon, which took 35 days to cross the Atlantic Ocean.
Because of limited finances, Thomas and Jane Brough settled in the area of Bethalto, Madison County, Illinois, where they farmed for 7 years. In 1864, Thomas and Jane and 6 of their children left Illinois, and as Mormon pioneers, they walked for 3 months and traveled over 1,200 miles to Porterville, Utah, where they made a new life for themselves.
During their first winter, Thomas and his family lived in a 12-foot by 14-foot dugout in a hillside near Porterville. Thomas Brough, along with his younger brother Samuel, had begun making the first bricks in Porterville. As they had learned how to make such bricks in their native England, Thomas and Samuel and some of their sons later manufactured high-quality bricks that were used in constructing a number of buildings in Porterville, Kaysville, and other areas of northern Utah.
These 2 bricks that are about 3 to 4 inches thick and about 8.5 inches long were made in Porterville by William George Brough, who is the second son of Thomas Brough. William George Brough was born in Longton, England in 1855 and died in Porterville in 1904.
Between 1867 and 1881, Thomas and Samuel Brough operated the old Brough Brickyard in East Kaysville. Today, the LDS Crestwood Ward House in East Kaysville is located on the spot where Thomas and Samuel once operated their Brough Brickyard. While I was serving as bishop of the Kaysville 12th Ward, we had a need to build a new chapel, and we began looking for property and located the spot where this building now stands. But it was several years later that we discovered that this was the spot of the old Brough Brickyard.
From 1877 until his death in 1882, Thomas Brough served as the first bishop of the LDS West Porterville Ward. His wife, Jane Patterson, was a midwife and practiced nursing for 31 years in Porterville and nearby areas. Thomas and Jane Brough had 8 children, 3 boys and 5 girls. Thomas died in 1882 and Jane in 1903. They were both buried in Porterville Cemetery, which is located on top of a hillside that overlooks part of the Morgan Valley.
Elizabeth Brough was the second youngest daughter of Richard Brough and Mary Horlston. She joined the LDS Church in 1847 and married Samuel Cartledge in 1852 in Staffordshire. In 1856, Elizabeth and Samuel sailed from Liverpool to Boston, and in 1857 they settled in Bethalto, Illinois. Elizabeth and Samuel were divorced in 1863. In 1864, Elizabeth married Enoch Tipton in Madison County, Illinois, and then traveled from Illinois to Utah. Elizabeth had 2 children by Samuel Cartledge and 3 children by Enoch Tipton, including William Enoch Tipton, who is shown here. Enoch primarily worked as a farmer and coal miner in Utah and Wyoming. He and Elizabeth lived in a home that once stood in front of these trees, which are located about 2.5 miles south of Randolph. Elizabeth Brough and Enoch Tipton are both buried in the Randolph Cemetery.
Samuel Brough was the youngest son of Richard Brough and Mary Horliston. He joined the LDS Church in England in 1857 and married Elizabeth Bott in 1858 in Staffordshire. In 1863, Samuel and Elizabeth sailed from Liverpool to New York and then traveled to Utah. During 1864 and 1865, Samuel and Elizabeth and their children lived in a dugout in a hillside in Porterville, Utah. In 1870, Samuel went to Randolph and built a 2-room log house located near 200 North and 200 East. When his family moved to Randolph in 1871, Samuel sold his farm in Porterville to his brother Thomas Brough.
In the 1870s, Samuel Brough built a large brickyard in Randolph. He then made bricks for the LDS Church House, the old high school, and for most of the brick homes in Randolph. In the 1880s, Samuel built a beautiful brick home in Randolph for his wife and children, for he and Elizabeth had 11 children, 4 boys and 7 girls. Besides being a brickmaker, Samuel operated a lime kiln, was an excellent surveyor, experimented with many kinds of grass and hay seeds, and owned cattle and horses. He was also a very religious man and attended to his LDS church affairs with real dedication. Samuel and Elizabeth Brough are both buried in the Randolph Cemetery.
The Richard Brough Family Organization, or RBFO, is one of the oldest and largest family organizations in the world. In 1969, my father, Hiram Carter Brough, officially started the Samuel Richard Brough Family Organization in Utah. And in 1983, that organization was incorporated into the RBFO. During the past 40 years, the RBFO has conducted extensive genealogical and historical research on the Broughs of Staffordshire, England, and their descendants. Today, RBFO officers and board members represent thousands of Brough descendants living on several continents and in many nations. And the RBFO website receives over 40,000 visits a month.
Since the 1890s, Brough family reunions have been held in northern Utah. This one was held in 1978 in Bountiful, and this one was held in 2000 in Kaysville. Several years ago, the RBFO began sponsoring international Brough reunions, such as this one held in 2005 in Randolph and Kaysville, Utah.
In 2008, an international Brough reunion was held in Meerbrook, Staffordshire, England. Over 100 Brough family members and relatives from various places in Europe and North America attended this event, which featured brief historical presentations, early family documents, and great food and wonderful conversations.
As a practicing Christian and member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I believe in the eternal nature of the family and in the importance of genealogy and family history work. Also, I feel that as people gain a better understanding of the lives and trials of their ancestors, they more fully appreciate who they are and what they have, become less critical and more forgiving of others, and strive to conduct themselves in a more honorable manner, because they soon realize that no man is an island, and that how I live today may impact my posterity for generations to come.
While the doctrines of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints teach the eternal significance of genealogy work and family history, people of all faiths and walks of life can enjoy the friendship and love that comes from being involved in such work. In fact, the many different families and religious beliefs within the Richard Brough Family Organization, the RBFO, have only added to its strength and purposes.
I hope you enjoyed this video that covered nearly 1,000 years of family history. In behalf of all the officers and members of the Richard Brough Family Organization, I wish you the very best of happiness and success in documenting and enjoying your own family history.